The year was 1885, and in the besieged city of Khartoum, Governor-General Charles Gordon stood waiting for destiny. Dressed in a uniform that suddenly felt terribly out of fashion, he was alone, save for a single, utterly superfluous bodyguard. Outside, 50,000 furious Mahdist soldiers were conducting a hostile takeover, having just breached the main. Perimeter Gordon was by all accounts exhausted. Decades of aggressive global expansion had taken their toll, turning the illustrious British general into a man who looked like he desperately needed a holiday, one he certainly wasn't going to get. He knew his fate was sealed, and that his life was just another sunk cost in the grand ledger of the British Empire. As long as commercial interests abroad dictated, policy men like him, tired, overworked, and increasingly aware they were surrounded by people who fundamentally disliked their presence, would be expected to sacrifice everything in the name of overseas profitability. But this deadly predicament, thousands of miles from the comforting certainty of London fog, had not begun with epic colonial clashes or grand strategy. It started, as most terrible things do, with paperwork and a bad decision. Act 1. The real estate panic. The British Empire was having a crisis of confidence, having just lost their biggest, shiniest, and most rebellious investment, America. They experienced a severe bout of colonization fever. The empire fundamentally needed new assets. Back in 1618, when England was still figuring out how to run a global enterprise, King James I had granted a monopoly on all West African business to the Guinea Company, based conveniently near the counting houses of London. For the next century, this outfit dealt in gold timber, and regrettably, the profoundly lucrative business of human trafficking. These ventures were quiet, tentative, and utterly boring. They were the equivalent of a diversified low-risk bond portfolio. Then came the American catastrophe. Right people shouted a fictional composite British official in 1783, slamming a ledger. "We have been evicted from the primary residence. Where can we find a fixer-upper? Somewhere with high potential, low existing infrastructure, and absolutely zero tiresome local governance." Africa was the answer. It sat there, vast and tantalizing, completely unregulated, and seemingly ripe for the picking. Unfortunately, Africa had a rather aggressive, deterrent tropical disease. European settlers had a tendency to expire horribly if they so much as looked at the coastline. The first attempt, Sierra Leone, was populated primarily by 1,000 freed slaves, a commendable, if small, gesture. But disease remained a colossal administrative headache. Every time the Colonial Office shipped over a dozen keen young administrators, 3 would be dead before the ship left harbor, and the remaining 9 would be too feverish to sign the necessary acquisition forms. Establishing new colonies was proving difficult, and worse, unprofitable. The British needed an easier entry point. Help arrived, ironically, from the Dutch. Since 1652, the Netherlands had operated Cape Town on the southernmost tip of the continent, monopolizing the spicy, highly valuable shipping lanes. When revolutionary France, with whom the Crown was currently at war, decided to subjugate the Netherlands in 1795, Britain saw the perfect merger and acquisition opportunity. Deny the French access to India was the entirely noble pretense, as the official narrative proudly stated. In reality, the memo read, "The Dutch are distracted. Quick, steal their very nice port. Send 2 warships. Make sure to look stern and mention freedom a lot." Cape Town was swiftly secured and formally integrated into the empire in 1814. It was a beautiful victory of opportunism over military necessity. Act 2. Administrative disasters and the HOA from hell. Acquiring Cape Town did not automatically grant control over the hinterland, which turned out to be less like a sprawling estate and more like a collection of perpetually dissatisfied neighbors. The British administration arrived promising loudly not to interfere with local affairs, a promise that reportedly expired around the time the first packet of English only administrative forms arrived 5 minutes later. Magistrates began implementing laws written solely in the dense, often illogical language of the Colonial Office. This caused predictable and immediate discontent among the Dutch-speaking settlers, known as the Afrikaners. "It is simple bureaucracy," explained an overly earnest young British clerk named Arthur. to a scowling Dutch farmer. If you want to file a complaint about the new zoning regulations, you simply fill out Form 47B, which requires notarization by a magistrate, provided you have completed the prerequisite Form 32A in quadruplicate. But please only use the King's English. We simply cannot be expected to learn another language. The Boers, the Dutch farmers, who had migrated inland searching for greener, or perhaps browner pastures, were a peculiar obstacle fiercely independent. Many had fled religious persecution, only to run headlong into British administrative persecution. They hated being told what to do. But the real flashpoint was slavery. Under Dutch law, it had been legal. The British Empire, after a prolonged internal debate, was steadily moving toward abolition. When slavery was declared illegal across the empire in 1833, the Boers saw red. Not because they were suddenly concerned about humanitarian law, but because they were now forced to deal with British red tape and a massive upheaval of their labor model. This triggered the Great Trek, a massive exodus where thousands of settlers packed up their wagons and moved as far away from the British sense of decorum and legal forms humanly possible. They founded new, gloriously independent and administratively chaotic republics. The Boers genuinely believed they had outrun the empire. They had not. They had merely delayed the paperwork. The British would soon follow, armed with superior weaponry and the unwavering belief that all independent land was merely unappraised inventory. Act 3. The Skull Trophies of West Africa. While the Boers were busy trekking, the British shifted their focus back to West Africa, where they quickly found themselves colliding with established local powers. The Asante Empire, located in modern-day Ghana, was not easily impressed by a few poorly supplied coastal forts. After years of simmering hostility, the polite imperial phrase for low-level property disputes and border skirmishes, the Asante finally provoked open conflict in 1824 by committing the highly offensive act of murdering an African officer serving in the British Army. This was treated by the British governor of Sierra Leone, Sir Charles McCarthy, as an unprecedented act of rudeness. Upstart savages, Sir Charles declared, adjusting his elaborate plumed hat. He was absolutely brimming with textbook colonial overconfidence. We shall crush them with 3,000 men. This will be a simple policing action. I expect to be back in time for tea and a strongly worded debriefing. Unfortunately for Sir Charles, his legacy would not involve tea. He and his 3,000 men were swiftly and comprehensively slaughtered by 10,000 highly motivated Asante warriors. The Asante King, in a spectacular display of both martial achievement and avant-garde interior design, then commissioned a goldsmith to turn Sir Charles' skull into a rather elegant gold-trimmed drinking cup. It was reportedly quite sturdy and saw years of enjoyment. The colonial office was deeply embarrassed, not primarily by the loss of life, but by the aesthetic implications. Losing a governor was one thing, having his cranial structure utilized as cocktail glassware was a serious breach of diplomatic etiquette. The British retaliated years later. After a failed Asante incursion, which was repelled by the terrifyingly futuristic technology of Congreve rockets, essentially explosive fireworks, a treaty was signed in 1831. Peace reigned for 30 years until the British predictably acquired the Dutch Gold Coast colony, immediately interfering with Asante trade. Roots interference meant war. In 1874, the British returned with a vengeance. After decisively defeating the Asante, marched into the capital, Kumasi. The soldiers wandered through the vast royal palace, marveling at its extensive collection of rare books and beautiful artwork. Quite stunning, isn't it? Lieutenant remarked to Major. A truly sophisticated culture. Look at the masonry indeed, Major. A shame to disturb it. The British soldiers then, in a grand display of cultural appreciation that baffled anthropologists for decades, took great care in demolishing the entire complex with high explosives. The logic was simple. If we can't occupy it, we must ensure no one else can appreciate it either. One can only hope that somebody remembered to retrieve poor Sir Charles McCarthy's golden chalice from the wreckage before the detonation. Act 4. a real estate broker named Henry. With West Africa subdued and flattened, the empire's attention snapped back south. The discovery of diamonds near the small town of Kimberley caused a massive spike in property values and British aggression. This mineral wealth required immediate centralized administration. In 1874, Henry Herbert, the newly appointed Secretary of State for the Colonies, was tasked with the unenviable job of organizing the chaotic Boer settlements into a neat, manageable federation, a kind of enforced condominium association. If we can govern them as one tidy state, Herbert reasoned, probably while sipping gin, we gain de facto control over all the diamond mines, with minimal logistical overhead. The Boers, who had trekked hundreds of miles specifically to avoid any form of centralized governance, were less than thrilled. Absolutely not, stated the imaginary Boer representative. We do not wish to be part of your federation. We do not wish to pay association fees. And we certainly do not appreciate your suggestion of mandatory weekly bake sales, Herbert, sighed the Boers. Were defiant, stubborn, and annoyingly litigious. He decided to focus on the other, equally pressing obstacle to British supremacy, the Zulu kingdom. The Zulus, under their founders like Shaka, had already established reputation as one of Britain's most stalwart adversaries. Though lacking the firearms of the Asante, they fielded a tens of thousands strong army, disciplined and utterly terrifying in close combat. British officials, like Sir Henry Bartle Frere, who treated diplomacy like an unnecessary precursor to invasion, desperately sought a pretext for war. They manufactured one in 1877 by occupying the Boer Republic of Transvaal and immediately issuing an ultimatum to the Zulu king Cetshwayo. The demands were absurd. Disband your entire army, accept British authority, and start adopting English administrative policies. To the surprise of absolutely nobody employed outside the colonial office, King Cetshwayo rejected these terms with extreme prejudice. Act 5. Overconfidence and the drinking skull's revenge. The invasion began in 1879. A force of 1,800 British soldiers, supremely confident and thoroughly unfamiliar with local topography, marched into Zulu lands. The Battle of Isandlwana followed. It was, put simply, an administrative disaster compounded by poor terrain management. The British columns were swiftly outmaneuvered by Zulu warriors who had concealed themselves until the perfect moment to strike. The ensuing defeat was so complete and so embarrassing that the British Army spent the next 50 years pretending it. Was mostly the fault of a misplaced ammunition crate, overconfidence, poor scouting, and the lingering spirit of Sir Charles. McCarthy's failure combined to produce one of the worst colonial defeats in history. Total disaster was only averted by the heroic defense of Rorke's Drift, where 150 British soldiers held off 4,000 Zulu warriors for 12 brutal hours. A stand so effective it momentarily distracted London from the fact that they had just lost an entire expeditionary force. The British learned the lesson of Isandlwana extremely well. Never, under any circumstances, underestimate a highly motivated enemy fighting on their home turf. They would, of course, forget this lesson repeatedly over the next century. But for now, they took notes. A second invasion was launched within months. This time the advance was methodical. The scouts were plentiful and the artillery was terrifying. At the Battle of Ulundi, Zulu warriors rallied to defend their capital. But the British deployment was devastating. Cavalry screened the flanks, while artillery, and crucially, newly deployed machine guns, backed the line. The machine gun proved to be the great equalizer, transforming a close-quarters struggle into a bloody, industrial rout. Cetshwayo was deposed, and his vast kingdom was added to the empire's growing portfolio. Act 6. Managing unregulated growth. As an uneasy truce settled over South Africa, briefly shattered in 1880 when the Boers staged an armed rebellion which the exhausted British allowed them to win, granting them temporary independence, events accelerated. Elsewhere, the focus shifted to the Mediterranean. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869, had shortened the route to Asia, making Ottoman Egypt a crucial strategic asset. Years of wasteful spending by the local Khedive's governors had bankrupted the world. Nation and European creditors now essentially owned the country. This sparked a thoroughly rational, anti-colonial, nationalist coup led by Ahmed Urabi in 1879. The British, always eager to protect creditors and commerce, saw their golden opportunity. They dispatched a large expedition to crush the revolt, under the pretense of restoring the deposed Khedive. During the subsequent Anglo-Egyptian War, the men aboard the British warships spent a considerable amount of time debating the best way to quell urban unrest in Alexandria. Their logical conclusion: open fire and burn the entire city to the ground, with Alexandria smoking. And the nationalists, decisively defeated at Tel el-Kebir, the British installed themselves in Cairo. The indebted Khedive was restored, but English soldiers were now comfortably in control of the nation. And the Canal Egypt was an unofficial colony until 1922, a perfect example of a corporate debt restructuring leading directly to a Military Occupation Act. 7. The Berlin HOA meeting. Despite these gains, British colonization was limited. The primary motivator, slavery, was gone, and most nations were content to squabble over coastal ports. But by the 1880s, the Industrial Revolution created a monstrous explosive demand for raw resources that Africa possessed in embarrassing abundance. Furthermore, Europe was producing an impoverished underclass, desperate to migrate, and with the Americas filling up Africa, became the last great unclaimed territory. Tensions rose as old rivals, particularly France and Germany, looked hungrily at the same maps the British were eyeing. It was a chaotic, unregulated land rush that threatened to trigger a costly European war. Stepping forward to manage this administrative nightmare was German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, a man whose competence was nearly as legendary as his mustache. Bismarck convened the Berlin Conference in 1884. Representatives of 13 European nations, and inexplicably the United States, who mostly just came to watch the chaos and take notes, gathered to carve up a continent. They agreed on a set of remarkably flexible rules for colonization, primarily designed to ensure that no European power accidentally shot another European power over a patch of sand, the greatest masterstroke of diplomacy. No African representatives were present. The continent's future was decided entirely by men using cheap, often inaccurate school atlases, and operating under the extreme entitlement of the moment. They drew borders based on rivers, mountain ranges they had never seen, and the amount of room available on the cheap map. Coincidentally, around the same time, the white man's grave was becoming significantly less lethal. Steamships allowed fast access, inland railways linked resources to ports, and scientists had finally figured out basic medicines for malaria and yellow fever. The machine gun, however, remained the ultimate tool of negotiation, allowing European armies to confidently subdue native populations with impressive statistical efficiency. Colonization had suddenly become fun again, and far less likely to involve your governor's skull becoming a drinks receptacle. But even machine guns could not compensate for the ingrained British tendency to underestimate non-European opponents. The British immediately stumbled into conflict with the Kingdom of Benin in modern Nigeria, a major exporter of palm oil and rubber. Benin refused to trade, deeply suspicious of British intentions. These suspicions proved entirely correct when a British official, James Robert Phillips, attempted to sneak 250 lightly disguised African soldiers into the capital. The disguised force was promptly spotted, surrounded, and slaughtered. This embarrassing debacle was immediately used as justification for open invasion. With 1,200 men, the new army marched through Benin, destroying every settlement in a swift, punitive campaign. Resistance was fierce, but the capital was captured. The British soldiers wandered through the beautiful temples, admired the intricate artwork, and noted the massive earthen walls built. Over centuries, they deliberated long and hard, approximately 30 seconds, and then burnt the entire city to the ground. "Job well done, lads," the commander probably noted, wiping soot from his brow. Another successful integration of private property into the empire. Act 8. The Gold Rush and the Terrible Holiday Camp. Just as the empire thought it had finally got a handle on the rules of the new geopolitical game? News arrived that rendered all previous treaties and conquests. Temporarily obsolete prospectors in the Boer Republic of Transvaal had discovered a vast deposit of gold. The price of South African real estate skyrocketed instantly. Enter Cecil Rhodes, influential politician, ruthless businessman, and a man obsessed with securing every square inch of African soil between Cairo and Cape Town, just so he could lay his personal telegraph lines. He viewed gold as an unfortunate side effect of acquiring the necessary land. The British government, wary of another direct conflict or another expensive, embarrassing skull incident, hesitated. Rhodes did not. Using his British South Africa Company, a private corporate entity with its own army, he embarked on a campaign of deliberate provocation against the now independent Boer republics. This led directly to the Second Boer War in 1899. Rhodes' company targeted the Boers with brutal, unprecedented repression, destroying entire communities and carting thousands of people off to newly constructed temporary holding facilities. These were places where people were deliberately neglected and disease was rampant. They were called with horrifying administrative banality, concentration camps. In these facilities, at least 46,000 people died from starvation or disease, while 20,000 were natives caught in the crossfire. The remaining 26,000 victims were Boer women and children. The irony was devastating. The Boers who had fled British administration were now being systematically liquidated by it. After nearly 3 years of grueling bushfighting, the beleaguered remnants of the Boer republics capitulated, allowing themselves to be unified into the Union of South Africa. The empire had won. The land was secured, the gold was flowing, and the great real estate competition had reached a terrifying new level of efficiency. But Cecil Rhodes was not finished. He had already begun the push north from Egypt into Sudan, determined to complete his grand vision. This southern expansion sparked a deadly confrontation with the Mahdist Sudanese, leading to the long, grueling Mahdist War. It was this war, fueled by imperial ambition and Rhodes' corporate greed, that saw the final tragicomic scene. In Khartoum, where Governor General Charles Gordon stood waiting, a tired, broken man, realizing that the chaotic rush for African property had ultimately only resulted in his last futile stand. The consequences of the Berlin Conference. Old men drew lines on maps were not tidy borders or predictable profits, but fire gold and the invention of the world's most historically terrible holiday camp. What happens next when the map is finished and only 2 superpowers remain? And how does one manage a massive continent that simply refuses to be managed? Find out next time as we dive into the final phases of colonial consolidation and the legacy of the Entente Cordiale.